Right now, you're probably eating something, or you just did, or you're about to. And when you chew, it takes seconds. Your jaw barely registers the effort. That effortless bite is so ordinary you have never once thought about it. But that moment, that completely unremarkable moment, is the end result of one of the strangest evolutionary crises in the history of our species. Because for our earliest ancestors, chewing was not effortless. It was a biological emergency. And the way they solved it is the reason you have the brain you are using right now. Let's start with the problem. Around 3 million years ago, our hominin ancestors, creatures like Australopithecus, were plant eaters. Tough roots, fibrous leaves, hard nuts, seeds that needed grinding. Their bodies were built around this: wide, powerful jaws, large flat molars, enormous chewing muscles that ran up the sides of the skull and anchored to a thick bony ridge running across the top of the head. They were, structurally, chewing machines. Then they encountered meat. Not through hunting, not yet. Through scavenging. A leopard's kill, partially abandoned. A carcass left on the open savanna. Meat was calorie-dense in a way that plants simply were not. A single successful scavenging run could deliver more usable energy than days of foraging roots and seeds. Calories on the open savanna were never guaranteed. So when meat was there, they tried to eat it, and immediately hit a wall. Human teeth are not carnivore teeth. Carnivores evolved carnassial teeth, blade-like molars with scissor edges designed specifically to slice through raw muscle and tough connective tissue. Hominins had flat grinding surfaces meant for crushing plant matter. Trying to chew raw, unprocessed meat with those molars was like trying to cut rope with the back of a spoon. Technically possible, catastrophically inefficient. Anthropologists have done the math on exactly how inefficient. If early humans had relied on raw meat as a meaningful caloric source without any form of pre-processing, they would have needed to chew for up to 5 hours every single day just to extract enough energy to survive. 5 hours of chewing every day. That is not an inconvenience, that is an existential constraint. A body spending 5 hours on mechanical digestion has almost no metabolic budget left for anything else. The jaw could not solve this, which meant something outside the body had to. Around 2.6 million years ago, the oldest date the fossil record currently supports, early hominins began using stone tools, the old Dawan industry. Crude by any standard, a rock struck against another rock to produce a sharp-edged flake. No handle, no refinement, no evidence of anything beyond the most basic intentional shaping. But that flake could slice meat. That rock could pound muscle fibers flat. The hide that would have resisted flat molars for hours now separated in seconds. For the first time in evolutionary history, a biological problem was being solved by an object outside the body, rather than an adaptation inside it. A species had outsourced a physical limitation to a tool. What those tools were actually doing was remarkable. They were chewing outside the mouth. By mechanically breaking down connective tissue before a single bite was taken, stone tools transformed raw meat from an almost unusable caloric source into something the hominin gut could handle efficiently. The 5-hour chewing tax began to shrink. Picture it. East Africa, roughly 2.5 million years ago. A small hominin crouches over a carcass in the early heat of the morning. In one hand, a quartzite flake with an edge sharp enough to draw blood. Short, deliberate strokes against the haunch. Strips of dark fibrous meat separate from bone. He pounds a section flat against the rock beneath him. What would have taken hours of grinding jaw work is done in minutes. He does not know what he has just invented. But evolution is watching. Because once tools were doing the heavy lifting, large jaws became expensive overhead. Evolution does not maintain costly machinery when it has stopped being essential. Over generations, jaw muscles weakened. Teeth shrank. The thick bony ridges on the skull that once anchored those massive chewing muscles gradually disappeared. The face flattened. The prominent, heavy jaw that distinguished earlier hominins receded. The skull became rounder, thinner-walled, with more room above the face. These were not separate changes happening for separate reasons. They were a single system decompressing. The entire architecture of the hominin skull, which had been dominated for millions of years by the mechanical demands of eating, quietly reorganizing itself around a different... The jaw shrinking was only half the story. The other half was what happened to the energy that got freed up. The body runs on a strict metabolic budget. The brain is the most expensive item on that budget. It burns roughly 20% of your total calorie intake while making up only 2% of your body weight. For most of hominin history, the brain could not claim a larger share of that budget because the competition was too fierce. The gut required to process raw plant matter was enormous. The jaw muscles were metabolically hungry. Between them, they consumed a massive slice of available energy. The brain could not compete. This is what researchers call the expensive tissue hypothesis. When meat, mechanically pre-processed by stone tools, became a dietary staple, the gut could afford to shrink because the food arriving in it was already partly broken down and far more calorie-dense. A smaller gut meant lower metabolic overhead. A shrinking jaw meant the same. The savings compounded. And the energy freed from both systems did not disappear into thin air. It entered the body's metabolic budget as a surplus that had to go somewhere, and the organ positioned to claim it. The organ that had been pressing against the ceiling of the available energy budget for hundreds of thousands of years was the brain. The numbers follow the logic exactly. Homo habilis, the earliest hominin consistently associated with stone tool use, had a brain volume of around 600 cubic centimeters. Homo erectus, who came later and made more sophisticated tools, reached 900. Modern Homo sapiens sit at around 1350. The brain nearly doubled across the span of technological development. That is not coincidence. That is energy following a path of least resistance. But tools were only the first catalyst. Fire was the second, and it completed the transformation. Now imagine a later scene. Perhaps 400,000 years ago. A group camped at the edge of a shallow ravine. Fire built against the rock face. This fire was not accidental. It had been carried, maintained, and deliberately kept alive through the day. Someone lays meat near the coals. The surface tightens almost immediately. Fat hisses. The smell changes completely. And what happens at a molecular level inside that meat is extraordinary. Heat gelatinizes proteins, denatures collagen, the tough connective tissue that makes raw meat resist every bite, and kills pathogens that would otherwise force the immune system to spend energy fighting. Food delivers significantly more usable calories per gram than the same food eaten raw because the body spends almost nothing breaking it down. Cooking was not comfort. It was a caloric multiplier. The energy surplus it created was precisely what an enlarging, metabolically hungry brain required to keep growing. The fossil record shows accelerating brain expansion in lineages with evidence of controlled. The correlation holds across every site where both have been found together. The jaw had become the bottleneck. Tools cracked it open. Fire removed it entirely. And here is the part that is almost impossible to fully absorb. None of this was directed. No ancestor decided to grow a brain. There was no foresight, no plan, no species-level ambition. They picked up a rock because the meat was too tough and they were hungry. They moved closer to fire because the cooked meat was easier to eat and tasted better. Each decision was immediate, practical, and small. And yet each one quietly shifted the metabolic equation inside the body. Less energy to the jaw, less energy to the gut, more energy available, more energy to the brain. Repeated across thousands of generations, those small redirections accumulated into something no one intended. The most cognitively complex organism the planet has ever produced. The most sophisticated organ in the known universe was built, at its origin, as the unintended side effect of a chewing problem that our ancestors could not solve any other way. So the next time you take a bite and barely notice, that ease is not nothing. That is the whole story.